Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at what is, hands down, one of the most chilling, head-scratching mysteries of the 20th century, the vanishing at the Flannan Isles. Just picture it. You've got this lone, towering lighthouse out in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. It's built specifically to keep the dark at bay, right? But then, in December of 1900, the light just goes out. And when people finally show up to see what's going on, what they find, or actually what they don't find, sparks a mystery that we're still talking about over 100 years later. So let's look at the facts, the absolutely bizarre clues, and the haunting theories behind it all, starting right at the terrifying moment of discovery. I want you to put yourself right in the shoes of Joseph Moore for a second. He's a relief keeper, and it's December 26th, 1900, the day after Christmas. He's arriving on the supply ship, the Hespero, returning from his leave. But as they pull up, there's no welcoming flag flying on the mast. And you gotta understand, that's a crucial daily signal for these guys. So the ship blasts its horn. Nothing. Just the sound of the ocean. They fire off a distress rocket. Still. Absolute, dead silence. When Moore finally steps ashore and unlocks those lighthouse doors, his three buddies are nowhere to be found. Instead, the place is just frozen. The air was totally cold and stale, like no one had taken a breath in there for days. The stove was ice cold. And, crazily enough, time itself literally seemed to have stopped. Every single clock in the facility had just stopped ticking. To really grasp the absolute dread of this situation, we need to talk about the geography. 18. That's the number of miles this place sat off the western coast of Scotland. 18 miles of volatile ocean completely cutting them off from the rest of the world. The lighthouse was built on Island Moor, the biggest of the Flannan Isles. And let me tell you, this is no tropical getaway. We're talking about a brutal, storm-battered rock, totally surrounded by sheer cliff drops and violent gray seas. And honestly, even before this whole disappearance happened, Eileen Moore had a deeply unsettling reputation. Locals actually called these islands the Seven Hunters. There are these ancient ruins there of St. Flannan's Chapel, and local shepherds would sail out to let their sheep graze on the grass, which was supposed to have healing properties. But get this, they absolutely refused to stay the night. No way. And that really matters because it shows there was this deep cultural superstition that when the sun went down on Island Moor, something else woke up. It was practically considered a forbidden place. Yet, because the shipping lanes around it were just so deadly, the Board of Trade spent 3 grueling years building a state-of-the-art lighthouse there, finally finishing it in 1899. Now here's the absolute kicker. You might be thinking, oh, they must have been easily spooked amateurs who panicked. Absolutely not. The guys who vanished were incredibly experienced men. James Ducat was the 43-year-old principal keeper. He had 20 years on the job, knew the brutal North Atlantic inside and out, and had a wife and 4 kids back home. Then you've got MacArthur, 40 years old, pulling a temporary shift. He was famously strict, known for having a seriously fiery, unyielding temper. And rounding out the crew is Thomas Marshall, 28, the youngest assistant. These were tough, hardened, disciplined guys living a super strict routine of 6 weeks on the rock, 2 weeks off. So back to Moore searching the lighthouse. The clues he finds inside are just completely contradictory. Make it make sense. The outer gate and the main doors, firmly closed and locked, but the kitchen door left completely wide open. The beds were empty, but they weren't trashed in some blind panic. They looked like the guys had just gotten up, started their morning routine, and vanished. And here is the real paradox of the whole mystery, the lighthouse lamp itself. Moore found it perfectly filled with oil, the wick was neatly trimmed, and the massive glass lens was wiped totally clean. So why on earth was the lamp perfectly prepped for the night, but never lit? But the most chilling clue of all, the thing investigators consider the absolute smoking gun, was sitting right there on its peg in the living quarters. Donald MacArthur's heavy winter overcoat. Okay, keep in mind, it's a freezing December in northern Scotland. The winds out there literally cut right through to your bones. For a seasoned guy like MacArthur, to leave the safety of the lighthouse without his heavy coat, it means he didn't have a single second to spare. He rushed out in absolute thoughtless panic. Something out there pulled him into the cold instantly. And guys, whatever happened outside was intensely violent. When investigators checked the western landing of the island, the scene was crazy. A heavy iron storage box was just gone. Thick ropes were shredded and tossed across the jagged rocks. Solid iron railings were literally bent and ripped right out of the stone. But the most incredible part? A heavy iron lifebuoy that was tied down 110 feet above sea level. We're talking about the height of an 11-story building, had been violently torn away. Its thick ropes just snapped.
It looked like some invisible, monstrous force had simply grabbed the cliffside and wiped it clean.
And to make things even more frustrating, the timeline shows a really awful series of communication failures. The mainland really let these guys down. See, 18 miles away, a gamekeeper named Roderick Mackenzie got paid £8 a year specifically to watch for the lighthouse beam and send a telegram if anything went wrong. He actually later admitted he hadn't seen the light between December 7th and the 29th, except for maybe once on the 12th, but he just never alerted headquarters. And it gets worse. On the midnight of December 15th, a steamship called the Archtor sailed by, saw the lighthouse was pitch black, and noted it down. But when they docked, the report somehow just got lost. Poof. So 11 whole days went by before the Hesperus finally showed up. Inside the lighthouse, investigators found a chalk slate. The keepers used it to jot down temporary notes before copying them to the official log. And this slate showed that routine weather data and daily tasks were recorded perfectly normally up until exactly 9 a.m. on December 15th. So what does that tell us? It means at least one of these men was alive, safe inside on the island and doing his normal routine right up until that exact morning. And then, nothing. Mid-thought, the records just stop. It's so incredibly abrupt. But then we get to the official logbook. Now, historians fiercely debate whether this specific log is authentic, but if it is real, it paints a horrifying picture of absolute psychological breakdown. Thomas Marshall supposedly wrote that a terrifying storm had hit them. He notes that James Ducat, the tough 20-year veteran, had become totally uncharacteristically quiet. And Donald MacArthur, the tough guy with a fiery temper, Marshall wrote he was crying. The very last entry, dated December 15th, reads, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." I mean, wow. Chills, right? And this is where the whole thing just gets totally unnerving. The logbook claims these terrifying, unprecedented storms battered them for days, literally breaking these hardened sailors down. But here's the catch. The mainland meteorological records show perfectly calm weather in that region during those exact dates. No storm. Nothing. Which leaves us with a really dark question. Was this some freak, highly localized violent storm that isolated just this one rock? Or was the storm purely psychological, raging entirely inside the men's own minds? So, looking at all these bizarre clues, investigators have tried for decades to piece together what happened. Let's move into Section 1, Waves, Madness, or Myth, analyzing the theories. All right, Theory 1. This is the official and most scientifically logical explanation, the rogue wave. And honestly, it perfectly matches that catastrophic destruction on the western cliff. Historian Mike Dash actually dug up documents from the 1950s proving that freak waves around Elian Moor could hit up to 300 feet high. Imagine that. The idea here is that two of the men were out securing loose gear, a monstrous wave hit, and MacArthur ran out in a panic without his coat to help them, and they were all just swept away. But there's a massive glaring hole in this theory. These guys were seasoned pros. You don't survive out there by turning your back to a volatile ocean. Plus, the sea almost always washes things back to shore. But in this case, not a single body, not even a torn piece of clothing was ever found. Okay, moving on to Theory 2, psychological collapse. Basically, severe cabin fever. The evidence for this points to the extreme isolation, those haunting logbook notes about crying and praying, and MacArthur's well-documented aggressive temper. Did the intense pressure of being trapped cause a violent confrontation? It's a gripping idea for sure, but the physical evidence completely tears it apart. Remember the inside of the lighthouse? It was perfectly tidy. Not one overturned chair. No blood. Absolutely zero signs of a physical struggle. Whatever took these men, it didn't disrupt the quiet order of their living quarters. You know, when science and logic fail to give us closure, human beings tend to fall back on their cultural folklore to make sense of tragedy. Over in the Outer Hebrides, the locals started leaning into legends, blaming these mythical entities known as the Blue Man of the Minch, or storm kelpies. According to centuries of local lore, these are deep-sea creatures living in the unreachable depths, and they can conjure up violent, localized storms to drag unsuspecting sailors down into the abyss. Obviously, it's not science, but it really shows you just how deeply the trauma of this disappearance shook the local communities. They needed answers. And that folklore actually birthed a really specific legend about the day of discovery. The story goes that when Joseph Moore's foot first touched the landing on December 26th, there were 3 massive, unnaturally large blackbirds just sitting on top of the lighthouse. And the very second he arrived, They all took flight at exactly the same time, vanishing into the northern sky. To the locals, those weren't just birds. They believed they were the lost souls of Ducat, MacArthur, and Marshall, transformed by whatever ancient presence guarded Elian Moor.
Ultimately, the official government inquiry wrapped the whole thing up by blaming, quote, extraordinary marine circumstances, which is basically just bureaucratic speak that offered zero closure to the grieving families, like James Ducat's wife and his 4 kids. Crazy enough, the lighthouse actually stayed operational with human keepers for another 70 years. And during that time, multiple keepers swore they could hear the names James, Donald, and Thomas whispering in the howling wind. Finally, in 1971, the lighthouse was completely automated and humanity permanently abandoned the island, leaving it to the silence it always seemingly preferred.
Which brings us to today. Those jagged cliffs remain exactly as they were. The crushing waves haven't changed. And every single night, that automated machine clicks on, sweeping its bright beam across the dark, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. But after 125 years, you really have to wonder, what exactly is it still searching for? The men are long gone, the island is completely silent, and the true fate of the Flannan Isles keepers remains buried somewhere out there in the deep.